Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are decoding a really specific, really intense worldview. We're looking at a text that claims the entire foundation of Western institutions has been quietly captured.
Right.
And not by a political party, but by an actual psychological reflex. Now, before we start unpacking this ultra-long, truly fascinating exploration, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show. It really helps us keep bringing you these exhaustive analyses.
It does.
And if you want to follow along or read the source material for yourself, you are absolutely going to want to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the book we are discussing today.
Yeah.
You also want to make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker over on Substack to keep up with his essays.
Yeah, it's an extensive body of work. The sheer volume of data, the historical references, the psychological theories he presents it makes it a prime candidate for what we do here. I mean, the scope of his argument is just vast. He's attempting to connect these tiny micro-level human behaviors to massive macro-level civilizational shifts.
Exactly. And the mission for today's deep dive is highly specific. This text is written explicitly for a men's rights activist, or MRA, and the sort of red-pilled manosphere audience. So if you're trying to understand the argument circulating within these communities, this is your primer. We're going to thoroughly dissect the author's claims about the history of our Western institutions.
Specifically how they functioned before they were, in his words, captured by feminists and Marxists.
Right. We'll look at the exact mechanisms he claims were used to execute this capture and what he thinks men should actually do about it.
But before we proceed any further, I think it is crucial that we establish a really strict boundary for you, the listener. The source material we're examining today is highly politically charged. It's intentionally provocative and deeply, deeply polarizing.
Oh yeah, very.
So I want to make it abundantly clear right off the bat, neither of us is taking a side here. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the ideology, the rhetoric, or the political stances of this content. Our sole job, our only mission today, is to impartially report on the ideas contained in the text.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. We are here to decode the author's logic, synthesize the data he presents, and help you understand this very specific worldview. We are treating this as an exercise in forensic reading. We're examining the architecture of the argument without advocating for its conclusions.
Perfect. So, starting with the architecture of that argument, Conrad Riker doesn't begin with economics, and he doesn't begin with politics. He roots his entire premise in evolutionary biology and psychology.
Right down to the biological hardware.
Yeah. He introduces this foundational concept he calls the click-whirr phenomenon. His core thesis is that the chaos we see in mock society is actually driven by female psychology, operating on a subconscious level.
And that term, click-whirr, is actually borrowed from behavioral psychology. It's traditionally used to describe fixed action patterns in animals. Basically, these automatic, almost mechanical responses to specific environmental triggers.
It's like a reflex.
Right. Think of a mother bird automatically feeding an open beak, regardless of whose beak it actually is. It's hardwired. So in the context of this book, the author is applying this concept to what the manosphere frequently refers to as shit testing.
Okay, let's translate that for someone who might be unfamiliar with the terminology. Shit testing, in this context, refers to a subconscious reflex where women supposedly test male integrity, dominance, and compliance.
And he's careful to point out these are not rational, conscious inquiries. They are primal probes. The text asserts that this mechanism evolved to help females assess the fitness and reliability of a mate or an ally in the wild.
But in the modern world.
In a modern context, Riker argues this reflex manifests as behavioral traps. For instance, he suggests that when a woman asks a seemingly innocent trap question, or when she deploys a phrase like, "I feel unsafe," in a corporate boardroom, she's engaging in a click-whirr response.
And there's a physical component to this, right?
Yeah, he points out that this is often accompanied by actual physiological changes. He specifically notes audible vocal pitch shifts, like a tightening or raising of the voice when a woman deploys these tactics. The goal is to shut down a logical argument and immediately shift the playing field to an emotional one.
And the book uses these real-world viral examples to anchor the concept. He points to a specific 2020 Starbucks incident that made national headlines. Basically, a manager asked an employee to wash her hands, which is a standard hygienic protocol anywhere.
Completely standard.
But according to the author, this basic request triggered a massive TikTok meltdown from the employee. The text breaks down how the employee used trembling lips, tears, and the specific corporate language of a hostile work environment to turn a basic request into a $27,000 Equal Employment Opportunity Commission settlement.
Riker frames that exact incident as the click whirr mechanism being weaponized. The logic here rests on the idea that modern legal and corporate structures have been conditioned to validate this emotional reflex.
They reward it.
Yes. In his view, the system has been engineered to convert subjective emotional discomfort into tangible cash prizes. It entirely bypasses objective reality or standard operating procedures.
So building on that psychological angle, the author introduces a second theoretical pillar. And he relies heavily on the work of the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung for this one.
The animus possession.
Right. Riker brings up Jung's theory of animus possession. Now, Jungian psychology can get pretty dense, but we can basically think of the animus as a psychological mirror. According to Jung, the animus is the unconscious masculine side of a woman.
Jung theorized that everyone has elements of the opposite sex within their unconscious. So for women, the animus is supposed to represent logic, reason, and the drive for order.
But Riker says something went wrong.
He argues that in modern feminism, this animus has become negatively possessed. Instead of that mirror reflecting a balanced, logical masculine drive, he believes it's cracked. It's morphed into an uncontrollable, toxic need to dominate.
He actually describes this state as women running a full-time dictatorship against biological reality. When a woman is overtaken by this negative animus, the author argues she replaces rational debate with emotional dictation.
The masculine drive for order gets warped into this tyrannical demand for absolute compliance, and it's based entirely on her subjective feelings at that exact moment in time.
And this worldview relies on the premise that this possession makes it virtually impossible to have a logical argument, because in his interpretation, the possessed individual isn't trying to reach an objective truth.
No, they aren't trying to solve a problem at all. She's trying to enforce her internal emotional reality onto the external world. If she feels slighted, the external world must be reorganized to validate that slight.
Which brings us to a massive portion of this psychological analysis, the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. The book uses this as the ultimate global case study for both the click whirr mechanism and negative animus possession.
He focuses heavily on the testimony of clinical psychologist Dr. Shannon Curry. She evaluated Heard during the trial and diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder, or BPD, as well as histrionic personality disorder.
And for those unfamiliar, BPD and histrionic personality disorder fall under what psychology categorizes as cluster B personality traits. These are generally characterized by dramatic, overly emotional, or highly unpredictable thinking and behavior.
Dr. Curry's testimony noted specific traits like a terror of abandonment, constantly externalizing blame, and volatile relationships.
So Riker essentially takes this clinical diagnosis of one highly visible individual and scales it up to a societal level. He lists the classic traits noted in the trial, what he calls emotional terrorism, playing the perpetual victim and weaponizing tears to manipulate both the legal system and public opinion.
And then he extrapolates this behavior. He claims it is the exact same script you see operating in university safe spaces and corporate HR departments.
He makes this really concerted effort to link progressive ideology directly with this kind of mental instability. To support this massive leap, he cites the NESARC study. That's the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions. It's a huge government database tracking mental health.
Right. And Riker claims the data shows that individuals identifying as liberal or progressive are twice as likely as conservatives to report mental health struggles.
The text drills down into this data. He points to the rising usage of SSRIs antidepressants in highly progressive urban hubs like Portland and Seattle. He also claims that 78% of far-left activists report having some form of mental health diagnosis.
So the overarching psychological framework he is building here is that leftist ideology is not just a competing political philosophy.
What is it then?
He views it as a manifestation of female-coded psychopathology, specifically those cluster B personality traits playing out on a macro civilizational scale. He is arguing that what we treat as political discourse is actually societal-level animus possession.
Okay, so if the foundation is this idea that subjective feeling is systematically overriding objective reality, it raises the obvious question. How does this actually reshape society on a practical level?
Which leads us directly to his next major argument concerning the hijacking of institutions.
Right. Riker argues that Western pillars, which were originally built on strict merit and objective standards, have been entirely captured by feminists and Marxists.
And the fulcrum of this capture, according to the text, hinges on a seemingly subtle linguistic and policy shift. The transition from equality to equity.
He is very specific with his definitions here. He defines equality in the classical Aristotelian sense. Fairness, a level playing field, equality of opportunity. Basically, everyone gets to run the same race.
Exactly. Equity, however, is defined in the text as equality of outcome. Everyone must finish the race at the exact same time, regardless of how fast they ran or how hard they trained.
And Riker views this demand for equal outcomes, regardless of unequal effort or competence, as a deeply Marxist concept. But he adds this biological layer to it. He describes it as a uniquely maternal pathology.
This is where he introduces a fascinating concept he calls the infant predator matrix. Reading through this section, it essentially looks like he is framing modern society as a deeply dysfunctional household.
Yeah, the infant predator matrix is his primary lens for understanding leftist governance. In this analogy, the corrupted maternal instinct splits the entire population into two rigid categories.
First, you have the infants.
Right, these are marginalized groups, activists, the chronically poor, or really anyone the maternal state deems helpless. In the eyes of this state, these infants require endless coddling, financial subsidies, and absolute protection from any form of distress.
On the other side of the matrix, you have the predators. These are the productive individuals, the high-earning men, the achievers, the engineers who build and maintain the physical and economic infrastructure.
The ones keeping the lights on.
Exactly. They are the ones forced to play the role of the exhausted parent who just has to pay all the bills. According to the text, the pathological mother archetype running these institutions demands that the predators be constantly punished, taxed, and socially shamed.
Their resources must be extracted to subsidize the dysfunction of the infants. It's a framework of mandated redistribution. And he says it's driven not by economic theory, but by an overbearing, emotional need to flatten any hierarchy that makes the infants feel inferior.
The book backs up this matrix theory with some highly specific case studies of what Riker calls institutional collapse.
Let's look at the education sector first, because he focuses heavily on the shift in mathematics. He cites school districts in California and Seattle that moved to drop advanced algebra in middle schools in the name of equity math.
And the standard logic of equity math frameworks often argues that separating students into advanced and standard tracks disproportionately harms minority and lower income students. It leads to disparate racial outcomes. So the goal of the policy is to keep all students together in the same mathematical coursework for as long as possible.
But Riker frames this as an absolute disaster. The text notes that when Seattle replaced merit-based tracked math with these equity standards, failure rates actually tripled.
He argues that instead of elevating struggling students to achieve excellence, this maternal pathology would rather mathematically lobotomize the entire student body than tolerate the emotional discomfort of unequal outcomes.
If no one is allowed to excel, no one feels left behind.
Riker refers to this as institutionalized mediocrity, and he extends this critique from K-12 education straight into higher education. He points to the infamous 2017 incident at Evergreen State College.
This is a critical example for his thesis. The text details how the college held a day of absence. This was a tradition that was altered in 2017 to ask white students and faculty to voluntarily leave campus for the day to highlight the contributions of people of color.
Right. And Brett Weinstein, a biology professor who identified as deeply progressive, refused to leave his own workplace. He argued that asking people to leave a space based on their race was a dangerous precedent.
The response from the student body was explosive. He was cornered and mobbed by screaming students, and the college president essentially yielded to the mob's demands.
The author uses the Evergreen incident not as an example of civil rights activism gone wrong, but as a perfect manifestation of the infant predator matrix in real time.
He describes the student mob as grown adults regressing to a state of literal infancy. They were demanding a safe space from words they didn't like, while treating a rational, productive biology professor as a dangerous predator who had to be banished from the community.
The book then transitions from education to the corporate and infrastructure sectors. He argues that this matrix doesn't just lower test scores, it actually gets people killed.
He points to the Boeing Starliner disaster and NASA's Mars lander failure. The book alleges a direct correlation between these engineering catastrophes and the implementation of diversity quotas that override hard engineering expertise.
The text asserts a really specific narrative regarding NASA. Riker claims that a senior diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI officer at NASA demanded gender-balanced input on critical engineering decisions.
And according to the book, this mandate allowed junior staff, who lacked the necessary aerospace experience, to veto a critical heat shield design proposed by senior engineers.
ultimately costing the agency billions of dollars when the mission failed. Riker's argument here is brutal. He says when you prioritize inclusion metrics and emotional validation over the rigid laws of physics and pure merit, rockets crash.
He also uses municipal governance to illustrate this infrastructure collapse. He cites the Department of Transportation in Seattle and their snowplow policy during a major winter storm.
According to the author, the city decided to prioritize clearing snowplows in minority neighborhoods to satisfy equity goals. This was instead of following the traditional protocol of clearing major arterial roads and emergency routes first.
The text claims this policy paralyzed the emergency response system across the entire city. It trapped ambulances and delayed critical care for cardiac victims.
Riker views this as the maternal instinct weaponized. They are sacrificing the objective functionality of critical infrastructure just to achieve a performative, emotional victory for the infant class.
The text also targets corporate HR departments, specifically looking at Salesforce. The book details how the company's leadership spent millions of dollars on pay equity adjustments to ensure female employees were paid identically to male counterparts.
However, Riker claims the company funded this initiative by simultaneously terminating high-performing, revenue-generating men. He labels this practice gynocentric cannibalism.
Gynocentric cannibalism. That is an intense phrase.
It is, and if we pull back and look at the broader picture the author is painting across education, aerospace, and corporate governance, he is suggesting a total inversion of purpose.
He argues that Western institutions no longer exist to produce excellence, generate profit, or maintain order. They have been entirely repurposed into therapeutic engines. They're designed to validate the emotional realities of the dependent class entirely at the expense of the productive class that actually keeps the civilization running. So, if these institutions have been so thoroughly captured and repurposed, the logical next question is, how is this enforced? How do you keep the predator class from simply refusing to participate?
That brings us to Riker's concept of the gossip, shame, rally industrial complex, or the GSR complex.
This is where the text brings evolutionary psychology right back into the foreground. The author argues that when male primates engage in conflict, it is typically physical, direct, and resolves relatively quickly, with a clear hierarchy established.
Female primates, however, do not typically engage in direct physical confrontation because of the risk of injury. Instead, they rely on social strategy. They groom alliances, manipulate social standing, and use ostracization to remove rivals from the troop.
Riker asserts that modern women have taken this ancient evolutionary instinct and industrialized it into the phenomenon we now call cancel culture.
Gossip, shaming, and rallying are the three sequential, highly coordinated steps of this weaponized social destruction.
First, you seek the gossip or the accusation. Second, you publicly shame the target. Third, you rally a mob to demand the target's destruction from a position of numbers and safety.
And to support the biological basis of this, the text points to a Harvard research study claiming that 73% of all workplace gossip is initiated by women.
Riker argues that this GSR complex has successfully dismantled one of the core pillars of Western civilization, due process. He compares modern corporate human resources departments to historical covens or Soviet tribunals.
A primary example he uses to illustrate this corporate tribunal system is the case of James Damore at Google.
For context, Damore was a software engineer who wrote an internal memo questioning the company's diversity policies. In the memo, he cited peer-reviewed psychological studies suggesting the biological sex differences might explain why men and women have different average interests in things like coding versus people-oriented professions.
According to Riker's analysis, the corporate response to Damore's memo was not a factual debate about the data he cited. It was a pure execution of the GSR complex.
The text describes how female employees and their allies utilized internal Slack channels to mass report him, coordinating a massive rally of emotional outrage.
This manufactured crisis forced Google's executive leadership to terminate Damore just to appease the mob.
The author describes this as the hive mind enforcing absolute conformity through manufactured guilt. He argues that the concept of microaggressions and anonymous complaint systems have been intentionally codified into corporate policy for one specific reason.
To allow women to completely destroy male careers without ever having to face the accused in a fair, evidence-based confrontation.
Riker then takes this lens of the GSR complex and points it directly at the hashtag #MeToo movement. He completely rejects the mainstream narrative that hashtag #MeToo was a necessary reckoning for serial abusers.
Instead, he frames the entire cultural moment as mass female psychosis and an exercise in industrialized mate suppression.
The book focuses intensely on the phenomena of false accusations, arguing that hashtag #MeToo abandoned the foundational Western legal principle of innocent until proven guilty. Riker claims the movement replaced it with the totalitarian impulse of believe all women, regardless of evidence.
And to build this case, the author highlights several incredibly high-profile instances where the GSR complex completely bypassed objective reality. He brings up the Duke lacrosse case.
Right, a notorious incident where several college athletes had their lives and reputations decimated by a false accusation of rape from an exotic dancer.
The media relentlessly fanned the flames of the accusation before any investigation was completed, acting as the rally component of the complex.
He also extensively covers the Rolling Stone UVA gang rape hoax. In this case, Rolling Stone magazine published a horrific, detailed account of a gang rape at a University of Virginia fraternity. The story ignited national outrage, protests, and federal investigations.
However, the entire story was later proven to be a complete fabrication by the accuser. Riker uses this timeline to show how feminist journalism inherently prioritizes the emotional victim narrative over actual investigative facts.
The text also highlights the hypocrisy of Asia Argento to cement its point. Argento was an Italian actress who became one of the loudest, most visible crusaders of the hashtag #MeToo movement. She publicly rallied against Harvey Weinstein.
But leaked documents later revealed that she had secretly paid $380,000 to silence a young male actor who accused her of sexual assault when he was underage.
By focusing on these specific examples of fabricated claims and staggering hypocrisy, Riker argues that the GSR complex is not about justice. It is an apparatus for emotional terrorism.
The author claims it grants women the unmitigated power to ruin a man's life, his career, and his social standing with nothing more than tears and allegations. They can bypass the legal system entirely.
And according to the book, they often profit financially or socially from the resulting attention or out-of-court settlements.
And that financial aspect of this dynamic is crucial to Riker's overall thesis. This leads directly into his analysis of the economic mechanics of this institutional capture, where he attempts to quantify the extraction of resources from the predator class.
The economic claims in this book are stark, to put it mildly. Riker calls this section the pink-tasked elephant. He aims to expose what he views as the massive financial asymmetry between men and women in the modern economy.
Let's break down the data he presents to his readers. The economic synthesis in the text is designed to portray a system of massive systemic wealth redistribution.
The author states that women control roughly 85% of all consumer spending in the United States. They are the primary drivers of the retail economy.
However, he counters this immense spending power by presenting tax data claiming that women only contribute around 32 to 35% of total income tax revenue.
Furthermore, the book points out that women hold 66% of all student loan debt in the U.S. Riker argues that a massive portion of this debt is taken on for degrees with negative returns on investment. He specifically targets degrees like gender studies, sociology, and the arts.
Conversely, he cites data showing that women consume the vast majority of government welfare, housing assistance, and social safety net programs.
Riker uses the provocative term fiscal vampires to describe this dynamic. He argues that modern women act as economic parasites.
To support this, he points to the staggering $890 billion in U.S. credit card debt, claiming a disproportionate amount is held by women funding lifestyles they cannot afford.
He points to the explosion of cosmetic surgeries, Brazilian butt lifts, and luxury goods consumption as evidence of this debt-fueled vanity. He even mocks the viral TikTok trend of girl math.
For context, girl math is an internet joke where women playfully rationalize expensive purchases, like saying, if you buy a $500 bag but use it every day, it's essentially free, or that paying with cash doesn't count as spending money.
But Riker doesn't view it as a joke at all. He claims it exposes a terrifyingly deep systemic financial illiteracy and an inability to delay gratification.
The crucial piece of his economic theory is how this debt and spending translate into political action, a concept he calls state dependency.
Because women are outspending their earnings and accumulating massive debt, the author argues they reliably vote for leftist, progressive policies.
Why? Because they need to use the government as a substitute husband.
Instead of relying on a singular male provider in a traditional marriage, they rely on the collective taxpayer, which Riker notes is predominantly made up of high-earning men to bail them out.
They vote for the state to forgive their student loans, to provide subsidized childcare, and to fund the healthcare and welfare systems they disproportionately use.
He views this as the infant predator matrix applied directly to macroeconomics. The productive class is relentlessly taxed to subsidize the endless consumption and emotional impulses of the dependent class.
But Riker argues that this economic model is ultimately unsustainable because it destroys the biological foundation of the society.
Right, the economics tie directly back into biology for him. This brings us to what the text calls the maternal suppression paradox and the womb strike.
He argues that the ultimate failure of feminism is that it hasn't actually liberated women. Instead, it has triggered a demographic winter that threatens the survival of the species.
This is a central pillar of his civilizational collapse argument. The text asserts that feminism has fundamentally pathologized motherhood.
By convincing generations of women to delay childbirth in order to pursue corporate careers, girl boss culture, and consumerism, society has essentially initiated a global womb strike.
The author points to collapsing birth rates across the developed world as objective proof of his thesis. He draws a sharp contrast between Sweden and Niger to make this point.
Sweden is often held up as a feminist paradise, featuring massive state subsidies for parents, extensive paid leave, and highly egalitarian social policies.
Yet Riker points out that Sweden's birth rate is crashing down to 1.5 children per woman, well below the replacement rate of 2.1.
Meanwhile, Niger, a deeply impoverished nation with almost zero state support or feminist infrastructure, has a birth rate of 6.9.
The author uses this stark contrast to argue a biological absolute. You cannot subsidize biological imperatives. He claims that female happiness actually inversely correlates with fertility when women are indoctrinated by feminist ideology.
The more liberated and state-supported they are, the fewer children they have, and according to his reading of mental health data, the more miserable they become.
The text presents a harsh, unyielding critique of abortion in this context. Riker cites World Health Organization data estimating that 73 million abortions occur globally every year.
However, he frames this entirely outside the bounds of the traditional pro-choice or pro-life debates. He doesn't frame it as healthcare or bodily autonomy, or even necessarily a religious sin.
He frames it purely as civilizational sabotage, stating that 73 million abortions a year is mathematically equivalent to wiping out the entire population of Germany annually.
He applies the same brutal calculus to the IVF and egg freezing industry. He notes that fertility treatments are rapidly becoming a $6 billion industry, which he calls the ultimate commodification and corruption of biology.
The book details how women spend tens of thousands of dollars to freeze their eggs in their 20s and 30s while climbing the corporate ladder.
But Riker points out the grim statistics of this industry. He notes that the vast majority of those frozen eggs never result in a successful live birth later in life.
He views this entire industry as a tragic, expensive deception sold to women by the very corporate and feminist ideology that claims to empower them, leaving them financially drained and biologically barren at the end of their fertile years.
This demographic analysis raises a critical question within the framework of the text. If women are increasingly delaying or avoiding reproduction, how are they still securing resources and commitment from men?
Which leads directly to the author's exploration of modern mating strategies and what he views as systemic deception. That transitions us into one of the most controversial sections of the book, reproductive deception dynamics and the legal meat grinder.
We are moving from how women interact with the state to how they interact with individual men. The author dives deep into a concept he calls dual mating strategies.
The text relies heavily on evolutionary psychology to explain patterns of female infidelity and resource extraction. The author describes the concept of hypergamy,
which is defined as the biological drive for women to seek mates of higher status, wealth, or genetic fitness than themselves. Riker argues that in a modern environment, women employ a dual, often subconscious, mating strategy.
The breakdown of this strategy is that women seek out a stable, reliable, perhaps less exciting beta male to provide long-term resources, financial security, and parental investment.
However, while securing that safety net, they subconsciously seek out genetically superior, highly attractive alpha males for actual reproduction, ensuring the best possible genes for their offspring.
To back up this claim of biological deception, Riker brings up the concept of sperm jacking and cases where women secretly alter their contraceptive status.
He cites data from evolutionary biology studies, including figures referenced from Oxford researchers, claiming that anywhere from 1 to 3% of fathers in Western societies are unknowingly raising children that are not biologically theirs.
He uses highly specific, terrifying anecdotes to illustrate this, such as a case study from the Journal of Medical Ethics. He details a situation where a woman intentionally faked infertility for 8 years.
She secretly tossed out her birth control pills to ensure she got pregnant, effectively trapping her partner into fatherhood and, more importantly for Riker's argument, trapping him into a lifetime of mandatory child support.
The author frames these incidents not as rare psychopathic anomalies, but as an inherent biological program running in the background of female psychology.
What he finds truly insidious, however, is not just the deception itself, but how the state legal apparatus handles it.
He points out that in many jurisdictions, if a man discovers through a DNA test that he was tricked into fatherhood, family courts will still demand he pay child support based on the legal doctrine of the best interests of the child.
The text frames this legal reality as state-sanctioned reproductive coercion. Riker argues that women hold 100% of the power regarding reproduction from abortion to secret pregnancies.
But the state relentlessly enforces their deception by threatening men with asset seizure and prison if they fail to financially subsidize a child that isn't theirs.
Which brings the author's focus squarely onto the divorce industry and family courts. The book hits this institution incredibly hard.
He views it as the ultimate destructive manifestation of the infant predator matrix in the legal realm. He cites Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data showing that women initiate roughly 70 to 80% of all divorces in the United States.
Yet, despite initiating the dissolution of the marriage, they receive roughly 97% of all alimony awards.
Riker does not mince words here. He describes the modern no-fault divorce process as state-sanctioned cuckolding and legalized robbery.
He fills this chapter with anecdotes of men whose lives have been financially obliterated. Men living in their cars while their wages are garnished to pay thousands of dollars a month in alimony to ex-wives who are actively vacationing with new partners.
His fundamental argument is that the legal system creates a perverse incentive structure. It incentivizes women to break up nuclear families by guaranteeing them massive financial rewards, child custody, and the marital home without any of the obligations of maintaining the marriage or remaining faithful.
In Riker's view, marriage is no longer a partnership. It is an asymmetrical legal contract where all the risk is held by the male.
And the text claims this anti-male bias is hardwired into the legal system's assumptions. To prove this, Riker brings up the Duluth model.
For those who aren't familiar, the Duluth model is an incredibly influential framework developed in the 1980s that is used by police departments and courts globally for domestic violence intervention.
The author heavily criticizes the Duluth model, claiming it was constructed entirely on feminist ideology rather than empirical criminal justice data.
The model operates on the foundational assumption that domestic violence is the result of men asserting patriarchal power and control over women. Therefore, the model inherently assumes that men are the primary aggressors and women are the primary victims in almost any domestic dispute.
Riker argues this ideological framework leads directly to massive arrest disparities. He points out how this plays out in standard domestic disturbance calls,
claiming that police are trained by this model to arrest the male on the scene, even in instances where the woman initiated the physical violence or where the man called the police for protection.
The book goes further into the legal weeds, examining some truly shocking defenses successfully used by women in criminal courts, specifically focusing on PMS defenses.
He cites the historical case of Julie Killick. Killick stabbed her boyfriend 27 times, resulting in his death. However, she walked free, avoiding a murder conviction by using premenstrual dysphoric disorder, or PMDD, as a defense.
To put that in context, PMDD is a severe, debilitating extension of premenstrual syndrome. Her legal team successfully argued for a manslaughter conviction by diminished responsibility, essentially claiming her hormones made her temporarily insane and unable to control her violent actions.
The text uses extreme cases like Killick's to argue that female biology has been weaponized into the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card.
The author asserts a glaring double standard. If a man attempted to use naturally occurring high testosterone levels as an excuse for committing a violent assault, he would be laughed out of court and locked away forever.
But Riker argues that when a woman uses estrogen, hormonal fluctuations, or postpartum depression as an excuse for extreme violence, the gynocentric judicial system bends over backward to grant her leniency and therapy instead of prison time.
He sees this as the ultimate hypocrisy of modern feminism, demanding total equality with men in corporate power and financial resources, while simultaneously demanding total biological immunity from the consequences of their own criminal actions.
So if the institutions, the corporate world, and the courts have been captured, as the text claims, it raises a vital question. Why haven't men pushed back? Why have the predators allowed themselves to be subjugated?
That leads to the author's next major argument that masculinity itself is being actively sedated and pathologized. This brings us to part 6 of Riker's framework, the emasculation industrial complex.
The author argues that it's not enough to rig the rules. The system must also break the spirit of the men who might rebel against it. He claims that traditional masculine behavior is being systematically targeted and eradicated from the culture.
He points specifically to the psychological and medical establishments as the vanguard of this attack. The text references the American Psychological Association's highly controversial 2018 guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men.
Riker claims that these guidelines literally labeled traditional masculinity, which the APA defined as traits like competitiveness, stoicism, dominance, and aggression, as a psychological disorder or a harmful ideology that damages men and society.
The book connects this high-level psychological pathologizing to mainstream media campaigns, bringing up the infamous 2019 Gillette toxic masculinity advertisement.
In that ad, the razor company depicted men engaging in bullying, sexual harassment, and aggressive behavior, asking, "Is this the best a man can get?" and urging men to hold each other accountable.
While the ad was praised by progressives, Riker categorizes it within the emasculation industrial complex. He argues that these corporate campaigns actively attack normal, biologically driven male behavior.
He claims they send a systemic message to young boys that their very nature, their desire to compete and conquer, is inherently defective, toxic, and in need of therapeutic correction.
The text points to the education system as well, noting how schools have increasingly banned competitive playground games like dodgeball or tag because they create winners and losers.
Riker also highlights the massive surge in medicating young, energetic boys with amphetamine-based ADHD drugs simply because they cannot sit still in a classroom environment designed for female compliance.
But the author goes significantly deeper than just cultural messaging and Ritalin prescriptions. He explores the technological aspect of this pacification, focusing specifically on what he calls the pornography trap.
He argues that modern internet pornography, and especially parasocial platforms like OnlyFans, are not merely adult entertainment. They are highly engineered tools of digital subjugation.
Riker has an incredibly harsh, unforgiving take on this subject. He states that platforms like OnlyFans are explicitly designed to financially drain men while simultaneously humiliating them.
He paints a bleak picture of a rising generation of dopamine-starved, sexless young males who are sitting alone in their rooms, literally funding their own biological and social obsolescence by paying for digital illusions of intimacy.
In a fascinating rhetorical twist, Riker actually quotes the radical second-wave feminist Andrea Dworkin. Dworkin famously claimed that pornography is the theory and rape the practice.
Riker flips this, arguing that Dworkin was right that pornography is a destructive force, but he claims that men are the primary victims. He argues that by engaging in this simulated intimacy, men are constantly reinforcing their own disposability, happily handing over their resources to women who view them with absolute contempt.
The text asserts that by engaging in this endless stream of highly stimulating digital sexual content, men are destroying their own neurochemistry.
They fry their dopamine receptors, and in doing so, they lose the primal drive to build, to conquer real-world challenges, to form actual relationships, and most importantly, to fight back against the institutional capture we discussed earlier.
The author views pornography as the ultimate pacifier for the predator class. It keeps young men docile, distracted, and biologically satisfied on a synthetic level, while their real-world resources, political power, and societal standing are quietly extracted by the state and the GSR complex.
So, having diagnosed this catastrophic multi-level collapse, what does this all mean for the reader? How does someone who believes this text actually respond?
That brings us to the final section, the Reclamation Toolkit and the Western Phoenix Protocol. The author drastically shifts his tone here. He moves from a diagnosis of despair to offering militant, highly disciplined solutions for his red-pilled audience. And the entire protocol starts with the individual.
Yes, the author demands strict personal rebuilding and absolute uncompromising discipline from his listener. He prescribes a mandatory 30-day hard reset,
This involves the complete and total elimination of all pornography and masturbation to repair those fried dopamine receptors and reignite the male drive.
It also requires permanently deleting all toxic, algorithmically driven social media, which he views as the primary vectors for the gossip shame rally complex.
Riker also provides highly specific behavioral tactics for dealing with the click war shit tests we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive. He advocates for a practice of absolute stoic silence.
When a man is faced with an emotional tantrum, a manipulative trap question, or a baseless accusation in a relationship or a workplace, Riker advises him to literally pull out a notepad and start taking notes.
The logic of the notepad tactic is to treat the emotional outburst with cold, clinical, Socratic questioning. By refusing to engage with the pitch shift or the tears, and simply asking for objective definitions and data, the man short-circuits the emotional manipulation.
The goal is to force the interaction back into the realm of objective reality, completely disarming the negative animus.
Beyond these personal psychological defenses, the text demands aggressive legal and societal defense mechanisms. The author argues that men must recognize they are playing a rigged game and start enforcing draconian boundaries to protect themselves.
For combating false accusations, he points to the Israeli model of investigation and demands that Western courts implement mandatory polygraph testing before any police investigation into abuse claims can even begin.
Furthermore, he advocates for mandatory minimum prison sentences for any woman proven to have fabricated a rape or domestic abuse claim, arguing the sentence should perfectly match the time the man would have served if convicted.
On the financial front, he advises men to protect their assets with ruthless efficiency. He calls for the normalization of smart prenups.
According to Riker, a smart prenup doesn't just divide assets. It includes strict, financially ruinous penalties for female infidelity. Critically, it must also include mandatory DNA testing clauses for any and all children born during the marriage to legally combat the reproductive deception and sperm jacking dynamics we unpacked earlier.
Having established the personal and legal defenses, the author zooms out to a civilizational level, presenting what he titles the Last Sane Man's Manifesto.
He outlines 12 foundational pillars of the West that he says have been systematically dismantled and must be aggressively rebuilt if civilization is to survive this maternal pathology.
Instead of just listing all 12 pillars, which range from property rights and free speech to the nuclear family and national sovereignty, the core insight here is that the author is demanding a total return to an absolutely objective, unforgiving reality.
Every single pillar he lists is designed to eliminate emotional decision-making from societal governance.
Exactly. When he lists the scientific method as a pillar, he isn't just talking about chemistry. He is demanding that objective, empirical truth must always violently override subjective, lived experience.
When he lists meritocracy, he is calling for a system that rewards competence and actively, unapologetically destroys the equity model, entirely comfortable with the fact that some people will fail.
When he lists separation of powers and the rule of law, he is explicitly demanding blind justice that refuses to acknowledge PMS defenses or the Duluth model.
He also heavily emphasizes diligent gratification and Judeo-Christian ethics as pillars, which ties directly back to his critique of the debt-fueled girl math consumerism and the need for a firm, unbending moral foundation to anchor society against impulsive behavior.
The author asserts that these 12 pillars are not just political preferences, they are the absolute biological and historical prerequisites for human flourishing.
However, his ultimate conclusion is surprisingly bleak regarding current structures. His call to action is for men to recognize the existing institutions, the universities, the corporate boards, the legacy media, the family courts, are far too corrupted by the infant predator matrix to be saved from within.
Therefore, he advocates for the creation of parallel institutions. Riker wants men to bypass the captured system entirely. He calls for building neo-trivium homeschool co-ops.
For context, the trivium is a classical education model focusing on 3 stages: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Riker's neo version is designed to pull young boys out of what he views as the female-dominated, emasculating K-12 public education system,
and instead train them relentlessly in critical thinking, physical resilience, and emotional stoicism. The text demands that successful men actively mentor other boys, especially those without fathers in the home.
It urges men to start their own merit-based businesses that explicitly refuse to implement DEI quotas or HR grievance culture. He is essentially outlining the blueprint for forming a breakaway society.
A parallel economy built entirely on competence, objective standards, and unapologetic masculinity.
The book concludes as a militant rallying cry. Riker is telling his audience that they are the architects of a necessary, inevitable renaissance. He is urging his readers to stop apologizing for their nature, to stop financially funding their own demise through pornography and consumerism, and to begin the hard, unforgiving work of rebuilding civilization from the ground up, utilizing the blueprint of this Western Phoenix Protocol.
It is a relentless, sweeping argument. We have looked at how thoroughly and aggressively the author attempts to link evolutionary psychology, female behavioral reflexes, and animus possession to the collapse of massive Western institutions, the macroeconomic system, and the legal framework of marriage.
And as we conclude, I want to reiterate the boundaries we set at the top of the show. This deep dive was an exercise in decoding a highly specific, polarizing ideological framework. We have mapped out Conrad Riker's logic and reported his claims to give you a clear, comprehensive picture of this worldview.
That is correct. We absolutely do not endorse the claims, the statistics, the legal theories, or the rhetoric presented in this book. Our role was simply to unpack the text as it was provided to us, allowing you to understand the architecture of the manosphere's arguments.
Thank you for taking this exhaustive deep dive with us today. I want to enthusiastically remind you once more to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these massive breakdowns.
And again, if you want to explore the source material and see these arguments for yourself, we explicitly direct you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy the ebook we reviewed today.
Also, make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker or to Substack.
To leave you with a final thought, something to ponder long after this show ends, consider the endpoint of the author's thesis regarding the legal and social defense mechanisms he proposes. If a society actually reaches a point where the fundamental biological and social trust between men and women is entirely replaced by adversarial legal contracts, hypervigilance, mandatory DNA testing clauses, and mutual suspicion, can that civilization actually be rebuilt? Or has the fundamental foundation of human connection already been permanently altered beyond repair?
A heavy, profound question to end on. Thanks for listening, and we will see you on the next one.